Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's Knowledge Group webcast, Ransomware, Best Defense Strategies Against Attacks. My name is Elizabeth. I'll be your moderator for today's event. We want to get right to our speakers in a moment. However, I do want to point out over the next few slides, you'll find information about the mechanics of our event today, information about our participants, and information on their respective firms. You can view certificates you've earned, your continuing education requirements, and more via your account page on our website or on the go using the Knowledge Group app available on iOS and Android. On that note, if your firm is looking for a new way to reach customers and help them manage their appointments, a custom low-cost app from Apps for Law Firms could help. Email info@appsforlawfirms.net to find out more, or visit the website appsforlawfirms.net. Finally, everyone will be sent a survey today via email after the event. If you're applying for continuing education credit, this survey is mandatory as a proof of your attendance. I'll be giving out 4 secret words at randomly selected times throughout the presentation. Please make a note of these words as you'll need to enter these into the survey. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment now to thank our partner sponsors, Deep Instinct Ltd. And the firm VLP Law Group. Their information is on the screen now. We want to thank our speakers for their time, help, and support in the preparation of this event, and of course, all of our attendees for joining us today. On today's webcast, we're joined by the following panel. Guy Proper with Deep Instinct Ltd., the team leader there of the threat intelligence team with a wealth of experience in the cybersecurity world. Guy has several years of cybersecurity experience in an elite technological operational unit in the intelligence department of the Israeli Defense Force, and he holds a BSc in biology and cognitive science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Melissa Krasnow joining us also, a partner at VLP Law Group who advises companies in the e-commerce and internet, healthcare, financial services, education, and manufacturing industries on responding to data breaches, including state laws, federal laws, and financial services regulatory, and the General Data Protection Regulation, preparing written information security programs, devising incident response plans, and facilitating tabletop exercises. Again, a great panel joining us today. We do encourage your questions for our speakers utilizing that chat window. Attendees, I mentioned surveys you're going to be receiving for your continuing education credit. I'm going to go ahead and give you the first word you'll need to make note of to fill into those surveys now. That word is attack, A-T-T-A-C-K, attack. The first word to make note of for those surveys. Speakers, please be reminded to say next slide at the end of each page of your presentation. And with that, let's all turn our attention to slide 11 and turn it over to our first speaker, Guy Proper. Please proceed.
Hi, everyone. So I'd like to start off with the agenda of what I want to cover today in this talk. The presentation is divided into 2 parts. The first part discusses ransomware. Ransomware, as you all probably know, and in return it demands a ransom from the victim. Now, once you go past this basic definition, there are many differences between different families of ransomware.
Your audio stream has
the sophistication of the attacker and different ransomware actors can demand different types of cryptocurrency in order to decrypt the data. This depends on their personal preferences or how much they desire to remain anonymous. What ransomware being encrypted. Next slide, please. There are two more general points I would like to make about ransomware before proceeding deeper. The first is that other malware is through the use of in which a victim receives an email with an attachment, and the attacker, if the attacker is successful, he manages to get the user to open the attachment and then execute it. And then there are very be executed, and then
your audio.
There are also more advanced methods, such as the use of remote desktop protocols, which is something I will talk about more later in the slide, and also the use of exploits, which these are both more advanced methods. The second point I'd like to make very often assumed to have earned its developers 100 times more than CryptoLocker, about $325 million. And this is all in about 1 year of attacking many targets. CryptoWall also has various means of spreading itself, either through drive-by downloads or through socially engineered spam emails, which was also a method used by CryptoLocker, and also through exploit kits, which these three methods together gave it also a very wide base of distribution and enabled it to attack lots of victims. I'd like to move forward a few years to 2017. This was probably the worst year for users in terms of ransomware attacks. There were extremely destructive ransomware in 2017, and they brought the attention of the world to ransomware and to how much damage it can cause. There were lots of families that year, but I'd like to focus on one family of ransomware that I think almost everyone heard about, called WannaCry, and on two families of wipers called Bad Rabbit and NotPetya. What was special about all of these families actually is that all of them used an exploit which was leaked from the NSA about 2 months before the WannaCry attack. The exploit was called Eternal Blue. And I don't want to really go into details about how it worked, but the bottom line is that it was not patched quickly enough by organizations around the world. And this enabled all of these families to use it in order to spread extremely quickly inside infected networks. And also to reach infected networks, this could be the foothold of these malwares inside the infected network before spreading. Some more points that should be mentioned about all of these families is that the spread was extremely fast-paced, also not only through Eternal Blue, but also through their ability to extract passwords within the network they attacked, meaning once they attacked a single computer, they could try and extract passwords from it and try to spread through these passwords to other computers in the network. So if they managed to get to an IT or administrator computer, they could spread to the rest of the company network and do that extremely quickly, and then encrypt the whole network. As a result of these methods, these malware were caused the first real noticeable financial damage due to ransomware. Some examples which I have is that the NHS the National Health Service in the UK was one of the biggest targets attacked by WannaCry, and the losses there are estimated at $92 million. And recent reports estimate the total global loss as a result of the WannaCry attack at $4 billion. So these are really, really heavy financial damages caused due to malware, and this was the first real case of such heavy damage. I want to move forward 1 year to 2018. This year saw the rise of a model that existed previously, but now it was more developed. It's called Ransomware as a Service, or RAAS. The families I'd like to focus on, which used this model in 2018, are families called Gantt, Crab, and Ryuk. The Ransomware as a Service model means that there is a team of developers who develop the ransomware, and they look for affiliates who help them spread the ransomware and attack victims. The way this model works is that the affiliates get the ransomware from the developers, and then once they attack, they get a certain part of the profit for each successful attack. So, for example, an affiliate can get 70% of the profit from his attacks, and 30% goes to the developers. This, of course, can change between ransomware families and between different attackers and affiliates. If an affiliate is really successful, he might make more than the 70%. However, this is a general example. One more thing that was special about both of these families is that they started using more sophisticated attack methods. For example, both ransomware families abused MSP programs. These are managed service provider programs or managed security provider programs, which often have a very widespread inside organizations. I'm going to give specific examples of specific attacks which abuse these programs later in the presentation. And in addition, both ransomware families started to use fileless attacks to spread themselves, which made them much more destructive and harder to stop. As a result, both ransomware families started demanding higher amounts of ransom than what was previously the norm. And in addition, they were very, very targeted. They stopped attacking individual targets, which was the norm before these ransomware families appeared, and they started attacking corporate large targets. So the number of successful attacks was much lower, but if they managed to pull off one successful attack, then the ransom that they could demand was very, very high. GandCrab stopped developing itself several months ago, and once the developers stopped the program, they posted in some underground forums, and they said that they made over 2 billion in ransom payments, and each developer earned over 150 million per year, meaning that if the ransomware was active for 2 years, each developer earned around $300 million for the ransomware activities. I'd like to move on to the final ransomware family I discussed in this slide, called Sodinokibi. This was probably the major ransomware of this year. Based on lots of research done in the past few months, it appears to be an improvement on the GandCrab ransomware. This is based on code similarities between two families and some activity similarities. If anyone is interested in knowing more about the similarity, they can reach out to me after the presentation and I can send more materials. Some points that are very interesting about Sodinokibi, and I will also provide more details about that in the next slide, is that the developers behind this ransomware, can you move back to the previous slide? Thank you. The developers behind this ransomware appear to be very professional, and they continue to abuse the sophisticated methods started by GandCrab and Ryuk, such as the abuse of remote desktop protocol connections and managed service provider programs. And also their attacks are very highly targeted and their profits are very, very high, though I don't have the exact numbers in the slide. To sum up this very extensive slide, the bottom line here is that over time we can see the ransomware actors are becoming more and more sophisticated and are becoming more targeted and focusing on more lucrative targets, which can get them a higher profit. Next slide, please. I'd like to provide some stats on recent ransomware attacks. This is from the second and third quarter of this year. The graph is from NCSoft. I have the source at the bottom of the slide. As you can see, the most common ransomware family by far is a family called Stop or Deja Vu. This is a family which attacks, does not attack companies, it attacks individuals and consumers. And as a result, it demands less ransom, but it's been extremely widespread based on submissions to online analysis platforms. You can see that GandCrab and Sodinokibi, which I discussed in the previous slide, account for around 7% of total attacks in the second and third quarter. But remember that Sodinokibi is an extremely targeted ransomware and that GandCrab stopped being developed sometime around the second quarter of this year. Some other ransomware families that have been pretty common this past year are Dharma and Phobos, which are also families which mainly target consumers, but they also in some cases target businesses and governments. Next slide, please. In this slide, I'd like to provide a bit more statistics to continue the points I made on previous slides. The first point is that we can see ransomware attacks are becoming more and more targeted. There are many different statistics to show this point, but I chose to focus on one thing, which is attacks on local governments. We can see that over the past 4 years, except for 2017, there has been an increase for the past 2 years in attacks on local governments. The data for 2019 is an estimate because it was collected in April, and it was multiplied by 3 to estimate the data for the entire year. However, I assume that the final number of local government attacks in this year will be much higher because we see almost every week in the news some ransomware family which attacks local governments. This mostly happens in the United States, or at least it's mostly reported in the United States because many ransomware attacks are not reported. Some more points that are very interesting about ransomware attacks for the past 2 years are that The first point is that 85% of managed service providers reported attacks against their clients, which are small and medium businesses, over the past 2 years. This means that pretty much almost all of the managed security providers had at least one of their clients attacked in the past 2 years by ransomware. This shows what a big threat ransomware is. And you can also see that ransomware attacks increased by 74% year over year. That means 2018 compared to 2019. In addition, the average cost of business downtime as a result of a ransomware attack is $141,000, while the average ransom demand, which was driven higher by ransom families such as Ryuk and Gantcraft, is $5,900. Though I'm going to talk about this in the next few slides, that decryption does not mean that your data will actually be decrypted and that you will be safe. But you can see that attackers are asking for, in a business sense, they are asking for reasonable prices for decryption. They know what the cost of the business downtime is, and they want to price their ransom demand so that businesses will consider paying them instead of trying to recover the data by themselves. However, paying the attackers in many cases will not have your data decrypted, and even if it does not mean that you are safe. The last point I'd like to make about recent attacks is an example of financial loss caused to a publicly traded company due to a ransomware attack. Norsk Hydro is a large aluminum company, which is publicly traded, and it was attacked in the first quarter of this year by a ransomware called Goga. As a result of the attack, the company reported losses of $50 to $75 million. Since the day of the attack, the stock price decreased by 12%. This data is relevant to around 2 weeks ago, so it might have changed since then, but you can see the huge amount of damage caused to this company because of one ransomware attack for which it was not ready to deal with. If you would like to know more about these points, and the sources are here in the slide, and you can look at them later. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to zoom in to a specific ransomware family. This family is called Sudinokibi, and in this slide I'd like to provide some examples of attacks that this ransomware executed in the past several months. The final point in this slide, which I'd actually like to start with, is that this is just a small example of the attacks performed by Sudinokibi, because in many cases, ransomware attacks are not reported by the company which was attacked. And even if the attack is reported, then the specific ransomware family is not attributed, so you don't know which family attacked the specific company. So the first example of an attack that was executed by Sudinokibi was in April 2019. In this attack, the ransomware exploited a 0-day in a program called WebLogic by Oracle. This program is widely used by managed service providers. And due to this 0-day, the ransomware managed to infiltrate the program and all the clients using the program and attacked all of them. The number of clients attacked has not been published, but it's assumed that dozens of clients were attacked which used this program. In June 2019, we see a similar example. However, in this case, it's even more sophisticated. In this case, Sudinokibi attacked several managed service provider tools. One tool was by Webroot called Management Console, and the second tool was by Kaseya. These tools were attacked to infiltrate lots of organizations using this tool. It's very important to point out that the initial access to most of these tools was not through a specific 0-day or a weakness in them, but through badly secured remote desktop connections to the internet. These programs were connected to the internet, and the attackers could scan and look for these connections. And once they found them, in many cases, they could use very weak passwords to enter them. And once they entered them, it was basically as if they were inside the attacked organization, and they could use these programs to reach to any computer on which this program was deployed. So dozens of organizations were affected by this. And to make it even harder, in most cases, the attack was completely fileless. So it was even harder for security programs to recognize this attack because it was both fileless and it was coming from a source that was trusted by many programs. In August 2019, this ransomware had a coordinated attack on 22 local governments in Texas with an extremely high ransom demand of $2.5 million. Actually, in this case, I don't know if the ransomware, if the demand was met or not. Next slide, please. One final point I'd like to make about this family and about actually cybercrime in general. In this slide is a post from a dark web forum by probably one of the main developers of this malware. I'm not going to read the post, but the bottom line of what he says here is that he's looking for skilled and experienced affiliates to join his program. He wants them to have a proven track record of ransomware experience, and he's not going to let any beginners join his program. And he says that anyone who can prove his track record and is successful will also earn his fair share in the program. The point that I want to show through the slide is that cybercrime and ransomware is becoming more and more professional. The people behind it are acting more like a business. They have several years of experience. They know what they're doing, and they know what they're looking for. So it's much harder to combat them, and the means to combat them have to be developed faster because they are becoming stronger and more experienced over time. Next slide, please. That was the end of the first part of my presentation where I discussed the threat of ransomware. In the second part, I want to talk about how to defend against ransomware. Next slide, please. In this slide, I would like to show the different stages of attack. This is what's shown in the phase column, the different stages of a ransomware attack, and then the defense tool, which can be used in this stage to stop the attack, the capabilities of this defense tool, and its limitations and how it can be bypassed. The first stage of any attack is recon and preparation. The defense tool, which can be used in this case, is threat intelligence. This can be used to detect the preparation for the attack against a specific organization or by a specific attack group. However, this tool is very limited because it can only provide intelligence in the case that the attack is targeted against specific companies or other specific targets, and it demands a wide and active presence in the dark web, which is something that is very, very hard to achieve. The second stage of attack is delivery of the malware. There are many defense tools which try to defend against this stage of attack. For example, firewalls, email and spam filtering, they are very common tools. In addition, training of users to recognize phishing and testing them to recognize phishing. These are also defense tools which can be used to stop delivery. And if these tools are successful, they can block the malicious email or web content which is being sent by the attackers. However, the limitation of these tools is that, first of all, users can be socially engineered and can be bypassed by phishing. This is something which is very, very common and is seen every day with different malware families. And in addition, attackers can innovate and try and bypass some of these filters, for example, through the use of new file types to bypass firewalls and email and spam gateways. If the delivery is successful, then the next stage in the attack is the installation of the malware. Here, there are also many defense tools which can be used to act against this. The most common tools are static and dynamic analysis tools and patch management. Patch management is extremely critical, and in many cases, it is not done quickly enough by organizations. They do not patch their programs on time, and then they leave themselves vulnerable to known exploits, which are exploited by attackers very quickly in order to reach the organizations which could not patch themselves on time. If these defense tools are used, then they can block the installation of the malware through various means. For example, they can block the file itself, they can redirect the file to a honeypot, and then it will be installed on something which will not harm the organization. And they can also block other different parts of the attack. However, they can also be bypassed. The most common ways to bypass them are through exploits or vulnerabilities in some of the tools. And a very common tool which is used by attackers, not just in ransomware, but in any malware, is creating polymorphic malware. This means that the malware payload can change very, very quickly so that it looks slightly different in every attack. And then this makes it much harder for security tools to catch all of the files which are being sent in the attack. In case this stage is successful, then in a ransomware attack, the next stage would be encryption of the computer. The main defense tool here is behavioral analysis, which can detect ransomware behavior and block the encryption process. The main way to bypass this tool is through the use of something called dual-use tools. These are tools which can be used also for legitimate purposes. For example, there's a program called BitLocker, which belongs to Windows, and it can be used to encrypt machines. This can also be used by attackers in order to encrypt files, and it's extremely hard for security programs to see when the program is used for a legitimate purpose and when it's used for malicious purposes. In addition, attackers can use new encryption processes in order to bypass the behavioral analysis. And then there is the post-attack stage after the files were encrypted. In this case, the defense tools are backups which have been created on time by the organization, or the ability to decrypt files either through contacting the attacker and paying them, or through a weakness found in the ransomware, which enables the victim to encrypt the files on his own. However, in many cases, the backup is not sufficient, or the restore from the backup fails in some of the systems. And I'd like to reiterate a point I made several slides ago, that decryption doesn't mean safety. In some cases, a company will get their files decrypted by the attacker, and they will be able to continue their business as it has been before. But in many cases, the decryption will not be complete or will not happen at all, or the attacker could go back and attack this organization again after they have been attacked once. So there is no guarantee here for safety. Next slide, please. A good way to defend against ransomware is to focus on the endpoint and to defend in layers. This enables the defenders to protect the user from themselves. That way, even if a user falls for a phishing scam, which will happen eventually, then the defense tools which are on the endpoint will prevent the ransomware and will prevent it in several layers. As an example for defense in layers, I wanted to focus on our product at Deep Instinct, and I will show how it defends in layers against ransomware. The first layer of protection is pre-execution. This means that a file is scanned before it is executed on the system, meaning at the moment it is downloaded by the user, before it can run, it's already being scanned by the security program. And if it is found to be malicious, it is prevented extremely quickly before it can run and cause any damage to the system. There are several ways in which the product does prevent malware pre-execution. The most common method is static analysis of the files. In Deep Instinct, we do this through deep learning-based static analysis, which is extremely quick and enables the product to predict on files which it has never seen before and reach an extremely high rate of prevention. So static analysis is the most common method here to predict and prevent files pre-execution. There are also some additional mechanisms which can be used, such as file reputation, script control, and blacklisting. I will not go into detail on these mechanisms. In case this stage fails and the file is executed, the second layer is on execution, and it also prevents the file and means that the execution does not cause any damage. This is through behavioral analysis, which can have several components, but for our talk, the most relevant component is the ransomware behavioral analysis. This means that if a file is executed and exhibits ransomware-like behavior, it can be prevented extremely quickly. the file itself is removed and the process which runs it is killed, and so no damage is caused to the attack system. The final stage, which is not a prevention stage, is the post-execution stage. This enables the analyst or the IT professional in the attack organization to collect data from the product based on the attack that was just prevented and understand what was prevented, and if possible, and if needed, remediate similar attacks in the future. Since this attack was prevented, then there is no need to remediate it. One more point I'd like to make is that in the case of ransomware, detection is not a good solution because if ransomware is detected, it still runs, and it means that the files on the computer have already been encrypted. So there is no point alerting the user that a ransomware has been detected, since the ransomware already alerts by itself, pretty much. So the only solution to prevent attacks by ransomware is a prevention-based solution and not a detection-based solution. Next slide, please.
Please pardon the interruption. This is Elizabeth, the moderator for the event. Just a quick time check, and I also want to go ahead and give our attendees the next word they need for their surveys. That word is file, F-I-L-E, file, the next word you'll need for your surveys. Please continue.
Okay. For the next slide, I would like to show a short demo of our product. I see that the layout of the slide is a bit different, but I would walk through this demo. This demo shows a use case of a ransomware attack in which a user receives a phishing email, and then through several stages, the attack runs, and in the end, ransomware is executed on the target machine. So the first step is that the user receives an email with a PDF attachment. The PDF attachment contains JavaScript, which can drop another file onto the system. Since the PDF attachment is scanned through deep static analysis, then the PDF file can be prevented pre-execution, and then the attack is finished and the user is no longer in danger. But let's assume that the PDF file was not prevented through static analysis. Then the attack will continue to the next stage. In this stage, the PDF file uses the JavaScript inside it to drop a PE file onto the system. This PE file is an executable, which is the main ransomware payload. This file can also be prevented immediately with deep static analysis and keep the user safe. However, in the case it is not prevented, we move on to the next stage of the attack. Next slide, please. Okay, the slide does not show the attack clearly, so I'll just explain it on my own. The next stage of the attack, after receiving the PE file, which was not prevented with static analysis, this is just for the example here for the demo. The PE file is executed, and then it is recognized with a second layer of defense, which is the ransomware component of the deep behavioral analysis. This component recognizes that the executable file is showing ransomware-like behavior, and it prevents it immediately and kills the running process. So in that way, the user can also remain safe. Next slide, please. In the final step of the attack, the SOC team or the IT professional in the attack organization is presented with all the data of the attack that was just prevented. And as I said before, the IT professional can use this data to remediate future attacks or to understand what happened in the attack and which users and systems are more prone to the attack. Next slide, please. To sum up my presentation, this presentation had two parts. The first part discussed ransomware and focused on what ransomware is and on a specific ransomware family. And the second part focused on how to successfully defend from ransomware. The bottom lines of this presentation is, first of all, that we saw that ransomware evolved very quickly over the past several years, and ransomware is here to stay and will continue to evolve and find new ways in which to bypass defenses and make money for the attackers. And as we saw, the attackers are becoming more and more sophisticated and daring. And they know that if they are successful and professional, they can make lots and lots of money. In some cases, even hundreds of millions of dollars. And then for the security industry, the best defense against ransomware is a layered one, which focuses on the endpoint and protects the users from themselves in case they fall into phishing scams and in case all the other solutions in the network are bypassed by ransomware. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. An excellent presentation. And attendees, I know we're covering a lot of material. So just a reminder, if you do have questions, please utilize that chat window. We should be able to have time for a Q&A after our final presentation is complete. I also want to remind you again about the surveys you're going to be receiving for your continuing education credits. And again, the words you'll need to make note of, I'm going to go ahead and give you the next word now before we move on. That word is ransom. R-A-N-S-O-M, ransom, that next word you'll need to fill into those surveys. With that, let's go on with our presentation. We're on slide 28 now with Melissa Krasnow. Please proceed.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you very much, Guy. Some of my presentation is going to cover some concepts that Guy covered, but what I'm going to highlight is I'm here to provide legal, regulatory, and law enforcement perspective. I thought Guy's presentation was one of the best I've ever heard on ransomware, and he put together everything really well and explained it. So there's some things that overlap. For example, slide 28. I have a definition of ransomware. It is from a publication from the department, from DHS. So I'm not going to go over the definition. What has really struck me is Knowledge Congress asked both of us to present a while back, and ransomware was definitely in the news. Timing is everything. Since the time they invited us, and today, I think the news and the developments have only escalated in this area, and that actually also includes pronouncements by law enforcement and issuances of guidance from regulators. And even this morning, I was still looking at news clips. Guy had mentioned local governments, municipalities. They have had a horrible 2019 contending with ransomware attacks. And unfortunately, the prediction going forward for 2020 is it's only going to increase and be a significant issue. And so it looks like ransomware will continue to be in the news. Within the past week, there were developments. In the US, senators from both parties sounded the alarm. This was a week ago, last Wednesday, particularly highlighting threats to small businesses. That was part of Guy's presentation, and government entities, also part of Guy's presentations by ransomware. And again, they received a classified briefing from DHS, the US Department of Homeland Security. Also, last Thursday, the FBI announced it was offering a reward of up to $5 million for information leading to the arrest or conviction of a Russian national. He was charged in a cybercrime spree that involved malware being used to install ransomware on victims' computers. So this is extremely significant. And finally, according to a public service announcement by the FBI in October of this year, ransomware attackers have targeted state and local governments, healthcare organizations, industrial companies, as well as the transportational sector. One thing that's also struck me, I read an article recently, you tend to think of these industries, healthcare, state and local governments, but you don't ever hear about financial services. And there was an article that just struck me. Why don't you hear more about them being targeted? In the sense, they're where the money is. And so there was a cyber exercise this year among the financial services industry, and they simulated a major financial institution being taken out by a malware attack. And it involved ransomware. So I think there's beginning to be religion in other industries. And as I said, you don't see financial services as much in the headlines, but I think they're aware if they're beginning to prepare for this. Guy also talked about how ransomware is delivered through phishing, and so that's the second paragraph on my slide. And I think, unfortunately, most of us have experienced these phishing email attempts. Hopefully not have clicked, but if we have, lesson learned. So I'd like to go on now to the next slide. So, understanding ransomware from an FBI publication, and it was this publication from October of this year. So the FBI talked about how email phishing campaigns are conducted. And there, when you click on what's sent, the malware gets deployed. What's really interesting is, and Guy showed a timeline about this, there's kind of a history. You used to see more generic, broad spread attempts. Now they're becoming more targeted, there's ways that it can be made worse by using precursor malware, and the criminal can use the victim's email account to further spread the infection. Next slide, please. Guy also mentioned ransomware is delivered through remote desktop protocol and other vulnerabilities. So what this is a proprietary network protocol that allows individuals to control resources and data of a computer over the internet. And so these are the targets. And finally, we didn't talk as much about this, but also a vulnerability, software vulnerability. Exploiting remote management tools. I did talk about managed service providers, but I'm putting this in sort of a broader category as the FBI put it together. Next slide, please. So annually, the FBI publishes an Internet Crime Complaint Report. These catalog the complaints that the FBI has received. So Guy made a point, a lot of times there is an incident or an attack and it's actually not reported, so it's not part of the status. So in fact, the problem may be a lot more widespread, but it's significant by this report. So these are the numbers. Close to 1,500 victims of ransomware in 2018 that were reported. Who knows how many weren't reported. By victim loss, this is interesting, and I kept in the footnote asterisk because $3 million lost by victims, but what constitutes loss? Interestingly, this might be a higher number because the number does not include the lost business time, etc. And also, you may need to engage a third party to help remediate. That's not included in that either. So this might be a lower number, but it's pretty significant, over $3.6 million. So that is actually very interesting reading. It's not just about ransomware or malware, it goes beyond, but I think a fair amount of content was devoted, and more so than in prior years. And according to the FBI service announcement in October of this year, the incidence of broad, indiscriminate ransomware campaigns has sharply declined, but yet the losses have increased significantly. So just to give you some background, next slide, please. So for the rest of my presentation, I think to look at what regulators, what law enforcement, and government entities are saying, what's really interesting is they all have an interest in this. It's sort of an issue of who is choosing to publish guidance, and I think the guidance will be increasing, and there might be more regulators and government entities getting involved, but you have to kind of look at it together. Each regulator or law enforcement has their own perspective, but if you look at it together, and I've tried to do this with the rest of my slides, I think you get a real fulsome picture of what they're saying, what they're asking companies to do. A lot of it deals with, to Guy's point, preparation and prevention. And if that is not possible and you find yourself in a scenario where there has been a ransom attack that's been successfully launched on your organization, what to do in that scenario. So CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is part of Department of Homeland Security. So this is, you know, what happens if you're impacted, and you may not have this as part of your incident response plan. Hopefully you do, but if you don't, some very simple contact points. So the first is ask for help and basically involve law enforcement or the government. So to this point, I think at a minimum, whether it's ransomware or data breach, at a minimum, every company should have contact information for their local FBI or Secret Service contact. It might also be helpful to know, and I'll have it on a subsequent slide, how to reach the Internet Crime Center, the statistics we discussed in a prior slide, but and have a connection and be able to reach them and beyond the hours of 9 to 5. And not every company has it, but if there's one tip I give companies to prepare, that's it. You may choose not to utilize it, but having it is better than not having it. Even better is if your organization has had a chance to get to know their contacts. So if there is a crisis and your company needs to call, they'll know who you are. That's very important. And it's also part of the mission, I think, of law enforcement in the US to reach out and create relationships and sort of improve their effectiveness. And then you probably are going to be engaging outside help. So have those relationships in place. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen where a company doesn't have those relationships, so there's already a crisis in terms of addressing the crisis, and you're negotiating engagements and contracts to engage an outside provider. Isolate these systems, remove connections to other business relationships, and apply business impact assessment findings. So these are 5 very basic points, but said very succinctly in this Department of Homeland Security CISA publication. So let's assume nothing bad has happened. Next slide, please. What if? What can you do now? And I think until it actually happens to you, whether you're an individual who unfortunately clicks on the link or you're part of an organization and they're impacted, now is the time to be acting. Don't wait. And this should be made a priority. So backup. I can't emphasize this enough. And this doesn't happen enough, but this could be extremely helpful. Update and patch systems is pretty basic and self-explanatory. Same with keeping security solutions updated. So hopefully your companies have an incident response plan. If you don't, it's a key part of responding, whether it's ransomware or security incident or other type of security breach. It's a roadmap for how you'll respond, and you can practice it in what's known as a tabletop exercise. And indeed, there are ransomware tabletop exercises. I have examples. If anyone is interested, they can contact me after this presentation. And I think a key thing is keeping up with the news. Maybe it happens to be your industry. Maybe you're in the healthcare industry. Maybe you're part of a local governor or municipality, but keep track of what's happening. And you'll be, I think, in a better position to understand what the threats are and also make it a priority. And I think, unfortunately, as I said before, ransomware will continue to be in the news. Next slide, please. I think, again, there are recommended actions, again, from CISA, the Department of Homeland Security. These are all very good. They're good securing your environment, and I think they go beyond ransomware. So they're listed on the slides. Disaster recovery procedures are related to this, so it shouldn't be isolated. And if you do have an incident response plan, or you have one and you haven't updated it for ransomware, it might cause you, and hopefully it causes you, to look at your disaster recovery procedures. The running joke is, if you do have an incident response plan, is it kept in a drawer and not updated? It should be updated as threats progress, as different regulators and law enforcement issue guidance. So it's a living document, and it should be updated. And maybe you put in a time period by which you just reassess it. Maybe there's nothing to update, but unfortunately, likely there will be updating. So I'd like to go to the next slide. These are recommended practices. You know, one thing that struck me is I spoke on this topic with Knowledge Congress a couple years ago, and I thought, you know, maybe the slides will stay the same. What really struck me, and I took the same approach, they didn't. There's been so much more guidance, and the threats have evolved as Guy presented. They're completely different, and I think probably 6 months to a year from now, they would be materially different than they are today. So restrict users' permissions. I think this is very basic. I think many a security incident has occurred as a result of failing to restrict users' permissions, and again, beyond ransomware. And whitelisting applications is very fundamental, very strong spam filters, and scanning incoming and outgoing emails. So these are technological solutions, configuring firewalls as well. I have a funny story. I received an email and I was sure it was spam. It was someone I didn't have a relationship with. They had invited me to bid on some legal work, and I thought, and it just almost looked too authentic. So there was an attachment to it, and I guess maybe it's being a privacy attorney, I did not click on the attachment. There was a phone number at the bottom. I called them on the phone. Indeed, it was legitimate, but in other words, I guess the saying is, don't trust but verify. And they were kind of surprised. They were asking me to bid on legal work, but yet I'm asking them, is this a legitimate email? Is your attachment spam? It was kind of funny, but at least I didn't click on the attachment. And you know, I have seen some very convincing emails from other attorneys asking to do things together, and they've had actually, they look like terrific websites. These are in foreign countries, and I've sent them to my IT department. They said, Melissa, this is spam. It's like, wow, but I went to the website that was listed. I went separately. It looked legit. No, this is spam. So don't trust what you get. It's sort of sad, but and as the attacks grow more targeted, there have been attachments that really are compelling. A great example in my personal account, I got one for my the college I had attended, and it purported to be. I didn't click on it, but it just looked so realistic, and emotionally I wanted to click on it. So be aware that these could be focused to you. Next slide, please. Backups, 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 more recommended practice. Guy discussed this, I discussed this a bit. And then keep backups on a separate device so they you know, potentially can't also be infected or accessed from the network. And then I just went over this, be careful, maybe don't be as trusting when you receive clicks or links or attachments to email. And use the telephone. I think, interestingly, we don't use the telephone. We ping each other back and forth on email. We click. Use the telephone and don't feel bad about it. I think the difference between making a call and being embarrassed and then actually having ransomware attack your system, it's not much of a choice. So yes, exercise caution when opening email attachments, and follow best practices for server message block. And if you see something, if you have an IT department, report it immediately. Better safe than sorry. Particularly a good IT department, or even if it's outsourced, you should be able to send them things, say, is this spam? And they'll let you know, and they'll appreciate it, and they may, as a result, if it is spam, wind up blocking it for the entire organization so others don't have the opportunity to click and become infected. Next slide, please. Update software and operating systems with latest patches. This is basic blocking and tackling of security procedures and helps prevent ransomware and malware. Again, don't click, verify, make sure before you do. Regularly back up and follow safe practices when browsing on the internet. You know, that is another area I find interesting. I have gone and browsed on the internet and not terrible sites, and I have gotten pop-up messages. I've alerted IT, and what they installed in my laptop was ad blockers, and that's not happening as frequently. Next slide, please. The FBI. So the FBI has weighed in, and I think they historically have published, and I think they're going to continue to publish. They are really taking the lead among law enforcement in terms of publishing. So what they say overlaps with CISA, but again, just so you could see what every regulator or law enforcement is saying, I guess we can't emphasize enough backing up data. One thing they have, which we haven't talked about, is awareness and training. And I think the awareness, if someone has clicked on something and sort of a lesson to be learned, or having training about, some links or attachments or types of fraud that's going around, that can elevate awareness, which is really fundamental, and maybe the person won't click, or they'll debate about clicking as opposed to reactively just clicking. And also, if they click, like, how should they handle it? Should they not tell anyone? That's probably not the approach. And then what happens at your company? How would an incident response be invoked, and what would different people do? And it's not just employees. Executives frequently, I think, are implicated. They're named, they're invoked in some of these. And so they should be doing this as well. Patching software, operating system, and on all devices, antivirus and anti-malware solutions. This is basic security blocking and tackling, but I think it will go a long way to helping prevent as many occurrences. Next slide, please. Again, there's sort of the idea of having access and restrictions. So this is the first point from the FBI. There's some other technological items that form the rest of this slide. And then we'll go to the next slide. So this is the FBI's recommended practices. And they make a mention of remote desktop protocol, which I find interesting. And this is something Guy talked about. We talked about phishing. You hear about phishing all the time. You don't always hear about remote desk protocol, but obviously the FBI is onto it. And then whitelisting, we've seen that. And then virtualized environments. And then sort of data governance points, categorizing data based on organizational value. This is valuable even beyond ransomware, and it sort of is the cornerstone for a lot of things. So, be mindful of that. And then requiring user interaction. So, let's go on to the next slide. So this is a mouthful. This is what many regulators are saying, and this is recent guidance. There's older guidance, but more and more is being published. And in fact, what really struck me is there was something very important. It's the middle of this from Department of Health and Human Services, which I'll get to, was actually published last week. So talk about timing for the date of a webinar. First of all, the Federal Trade Commission has had content on ransomware. They haven't had as much recently, but I think the most recent thing that I was able to find was they did a very plain English infographic poster on ransomware at the link I provide. And this was with a real focus to small business. As Guy mentioned, small to medium enterprises are disproportionately the targets and may not have all the sophisticated defenses. So raising their awareness and helping them plan, prepare, and hopefully prevent is crucial. So the FTC describes how ransomware is delivered, steps to take if attacked, and how to protect the small business. The next publication was this year, I believe it was over the summer, and it wasn't sort of specific to ransomware, but it was from the Department of Health and Human Services. Ransomware was one of 5 cybersecurity threats was covered. And what's really notable is the Department of Health and Human Services, which regulates the healthcare industry, has issued guidance on ransomware in prior years, which I will get to. But this really made the case that ransomware is a very significant cybersecurity threat for this industry. The publication is long, you have the link. What it does is it references ransomware attacks on hospitals, and there was a fact sheet that HHS published a couple of years ago, specific questions on the interaction of ransomware with HIPAA, which a healthcare provider or covered entity and their service provider, business associates, is regulated by. And I think one of the really helpful things about this publication is there's a table that it's entitled Suggested Practices to Combat Ransomware Attack. It outlines vulnerabilities and their attack, as well as practices to consider. So I think that's pretty worthwhile reading. And while it is geared to the healthcare industry, I think sometimes you have to sort of look at the substance of the information given. I don't see why it wouldn't be any less applicable to other companies in a different, just as general information. So I highly recommend that. And then I really, really, really like the publication that came out last week. OCR is the Office of Civil Rights. It's part of the U.S. Department of Health and HHS. And they had a fall 2019 cybersecurity newsletter. Perfect timing. What happened to my data? Update on preventing, mitigating, and responding to ransomware. Please, everyone, download this. This is excellent. They put a lot of time. So what this does is HHS issued a ransomware fact sheet. That link is the fourth paragraph of this slide. And you should also look at that. But this is intended to supplement that. And so I want to go through this in a little more detail because there was a lot of good information. So they talked about unrecoverable data, lost productivity, damage to reputation, to equipment, forensic investigations, remediation, expense, and legal expenses. These are all additional costs that can be expected when you respond to ransomware. And the actual cost, I think to the point of the FBI survey I had mentioned earlier, maybe several times more than just the ransom paid. I think Guy talked about the economics that maybe ransomware demands are kind of factoring in different, sort of the cost to the business. So they talked about ransomware attacks sort of targeted to a specific organization or industry, how ransomware attacks can be customized. And exactly to Guy's point, the ransom demands for this type of attack are often set according to the victim's perceived ability to pay. And so it's kind of related to Guy's point, but in other words, the attackers are getting quite smart. They're not doing this, they're doing this for a variety of reasons, and they are making money from it. And typically, the data that's targeted is sensitive. What could be more sensitive than healthcare information? And so, I mean, if in several instances where there was ransomware involving healthcare, are you going to pay the ransom if someone's life is at risk? And it's an incredibly serious question. So the other part that I liked about this is it talked about sort of what happens before the actual attack is unveiled. And the malicious actor, the criminal, usually gains unauthorized access to the information system of the victim, and they learn more. They find the data. They even locate the backups, and then they do this to learn more and also to deploy the ransomware with sort of a maximum destructive effect, and also to make it so that it becomes less of a choice of whether to pay the ransom, ensuring that the ransom likely will be paid. And unfortunately, disproportionately, a lot of healthcare organizations are fitting this profile of a target. So the publication goes on and it describes what companies in the healthcare industry are required to do to conduct, to basically comply with HIPAA. These are not bad steps for other companies. Since the focus of our webinar today is not completely healthcare, I would encourage you to read this. And the HIPAA steps for security, I don't think are bad ideas, even if you're not in the healthcare industry, and they might be said differently by a different regulator. They also talk about training. A training program should make users aware of the potential threats they face and inform them on how to properly respond. An organization's incident response procedures can greatly limit damage caused by a ransomware attack, and they may consider addressing ransomware attacks specifically within response policies and procedures, as mitigation actions may vary between different types of incidents. And key point, it's not enough to have a response plan. It should be tested, and this is typically through tabletop exercises where there is a negative scenario. It's usually catastrophic of a security incident breach. This could be malware and ransomware, and they test their plan. They have participants from a variety of functional areas and get their feedback on how they would react, and they find out gaps, and then they're able to update to ameliorate these gaps. And so having this plan is really essential as part of recovery from a ransomware attack, and I'd argue maybe in terms of preventing it as well. So the fourth item I mentioned is a fact sheet. This has been sort of, until this year, the key guidance. It's HIPAA specific, but it's really fascinating. So a very basic question, and I'll allow the audience to click on the link. You know, fundamental question: if a company is subject to a ransomware attack, would that constitute a data breach under HIPAA? HIPAA regulates data breaches for the healthcare industry. And so what HHS says in a nutshell, it's a fact-specific determination, and you would look at the definition of breach under the HIPAA rules. So, and they go into more detail, but that now is to be read in tandem with the fall 2019 OCR Cybersecurity newsletter I talked about at length. Okay. And then the last item is from NIST, which is a federal agency. They publish a lot of excellent information on security in general, and they have been actually active on publishing in ransomware. It's not as well known, but I would encourage folks to click on this link again and read what NIST has to say. It's not binding, it's guidance, but the goal is this publication will help guide organizations in establishing tools and procedures to protect data integrity, to detect data integrity events and respond appropriately and in a timely manner. So let's go to the next slide, please. Reporting ransomware. This is the question, and to report or not to report. So law enforcement will tell you to report it. Quite frankly, in a real life scenario, that may not always happen. And I think organizations have different tolerances and different considerations. But you will always hear, and I think law enforcement, when they present publicly, will make this point. They don't want to, and Guy made the point as well, just paying the ransom, you might embolden the attacker, you may not get your data back, etc. And this is how law enforcement is made aware and can go after them. So the last link is how you would file a report with the Internet Crime Center. And remember the statistics at the beginning of my presentation, they came from reporting at that crime center. I think part of preparation, having gone through with clients these ransomware situations, as difficult as it would be, if your company has an incident response plan and further does a tabletop exercise, going through how you would react and, what would you pay the ransom? Would you report it to law enforcement? Having the luxury of time and being able to discuss the issues would be fantastic preparation, even though it's probably a very difficult thing to do. And one related point, let's presume you pay the ransom or not pay the ransom, or you report it to law enforcement or you don't. Either way, you're going to have to give an explanation for why you acted the way you did, and discussing it in advance might be helpful and might unfortunately come in handy if this happens to you or your organization. Next slide, please. Should the ransom be paid? So the FBI says no, and I think I kind of said pretty much what this slide says. I think Guy articulated it as well. Go to the next slide, please. no more ransom. So there's a multidisciplinary group. It includes some law enforcement from other countries, as well as some private companies, and it has information, and they're actually advocating not to pay ransom. So I thought this was interesting, and this is another resource. Speaking of resources, let's go to the next slide. So one thing there's been a lot of really interesting recent developments, and that's how I'm going to wrap up my presentation. The FBI convened ransomware experts in a closed-door conference in September. That's the subject of the first article. And IBM, Kroll, some of the cyber liability insurance companies, and others were there. And they talked behind closed doors about responding to ransomware attacks. And you know, there was, I think, some good conversation. This is all from the news, but apparently companies and law enforcement were together talking. And that's very important, and talking about their different perspectives. And, you know, there was a company there, I'm not going to name the name, they negotiate with ransomware attackers, and another company specializes in tracing cryptocurrency, and they were there, even though the FBI clearly advises victims not to pay a ransom. So I thought this sounded good, that getting a lot of the stakeholders together in a room and discussing the threats and the issues. Another point that we haven't talked about, but I think is a significant issue to watch, is if a company has cyber liability insurance, it's a company by company determination. I think more and more companies do have this. So the question is, you know, does every cyber liability policy, insurance policy, cover ransomware? Not everyone does. And sometimes it might not be the word ransom or ransomware. The word extortion may be used. So you have to make sure you may be able to add that coverage on, or coverage for such an event, if it's not part of the policy. You could do that via endorsement. What is interesting, though, is there's been lots of media essentially, is it cheaper for an insurance company to just help the victim pay the ransom than having the victim, you know, get their backups and recover data? And there's an argument made that, you know, insurance companies are just helping victims pay the ransom and maybe perpetuating this. So that's something to look out for. I think a related point is what the pricing will be on cyber liability insurance going forward. But this is an issue that's starting to receive publicity. I think a couple years ago, when I'd reviewed cyber liability insurance policies, there just wasn't as much experience. Unfortunately, a couple years later, there is more experience, but it's an interesting point to be made. The other interesting point is, could a ransomware event be covered under a different policy like kidnap or kidnap and ransom? There are such policies which maybe weren't initially, as drafted, intended to cover this. So you should also consider how all the insurance you have or potentially could have would work together with this. So the larger point is, consider cyber liability insurance and what it covers. Also, you know, a significant part of a ransomware attack is downtime. It's not just the ransom. There may be coverage for business interruption is usually the term that's in the cyber liability insurance policy. So to come full circle, one cybersecurity company executive said his firm has been told by the FBI that hackers are specifically extorting American companies they know have cyber insurance. After one small insurer highlighted the names of some of its cyber policy holders on its website, 3 of them were attacked by ransomware. Hackers also could identify insured targets from public filings, such as the Securities and Exchange Commission filings, suggesting that public companies consider reporting the insurance coverage relating to cybersecurity attacks. So some interesting reading there. Finally, I have some more information, and so I give you the link to my attorney bio. I also write a quarterly column for an insurance group called IRMI on a variety of privacy and security related topics. So I'm going to wrap up my presentation. I'm going to give you the key takeaways. Continue to monitor news reports about ransomware. And one, I can't emphasize this enough. I don't know how many of the audience are on Twitter. I am on Twitter. I do not post what I eat for lunch. So, but I do post things that I think are interesting and relate to my practice. If you go to Twitter, even if you don't have an account, do a search using hashtag ransomware. You'll be amazed to see the information that turns up. So that is a phenomenal resource. I think of Twitter as more of a Google versus a personal what you're posting. It could be both, but there's a lot of really good information there. From a regulatory and law enforcement perspective, continue to review information issued by various regulators and law enforcement, and think broadly. You may have to put together information from different sources. And so, continue to monitor them all. And one goal of the presentation is to show some of these sources and the information. The information is as of today, and as I predicted 6 months to a year hence, it will probably change significantly. And then one other point I want to make is law enforcement should be part of your company's incident response plan. You should have an incident response plan, including for ransomware. Have the names and current contact information for the FBI and Secret Service, and if you can, establish a relationship with them before you need them, so they'll know you and your company. Preparation and prevention are very important. If you're able to, consider how you would respond to a demand for ransom before it actually happens. And determine whether your company has cyber liability insurance. If yes, is there coverage for ransomware? And determine whether there may be coverage for ransomware and other types of insurance coverage, and whether there's any insurance policy procedures that might be triggered in the event of ransomware. One thing I didn't mention is sometimes if there's ransomware or sort of a comparable event, before paying a ransom, you've got to get approval of the insurance company. So there are procedures. So in other words, you can't just willy-nilly pay the ransom. That may be different in practice, but it's a very important point when reviewing your insurance coverage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we've covered a lot of material, and I want to get time for maybe just one question before we go on to some closing remarks for our attendees. But first, I want to give our attendees that next word that you need for your surveys, that word secure, S-E-C-U-R-E, secure. The next word you'll need for those surveys, again, if you're applying for continuing education credit, completions of the surveys are mandatory as per your state boards and bars, and you will receive that survey shortly after the event today. Before I close out, I know we've covered a lot. Questions may come up later. Attendees, feel free to reach out to our speakers individually. The events materials that you have, that has their contact information. If questions come up later, again, we've covered a lot of information. I know sometimes that can happen, but very briefly, if I could turn back to each of you and ask this question here. Can a company that suffers a ransomware attack be sued in a plaintiff's class action lawsuit? Our attendee wanting some clarification on that.
This is Melissa, definitely, and it's already happened, and it may happen to parties such as service providers who are involved, not just the organization. It may also involve a service provider. So these are happening, and I unfortunately expect them to continue to happen.
Excellent. Guy, thoughts from you?
No, I have nothing to add.
Okay. Another question here. Could a company have a tabletop exercise that addresses ransomware? You have thoughts on that, Guy? I'll start with you.
I also think this would be that Melissa will have more knowledge of how to answer this question.
Okay, excellent. Melissa, thoughts?
Yeah.
Melissa, thoughts on a tabletop exercise that could address the ransomware?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Okay, I'm a little bit of an audio breakup there. I want to go ahead and turn back to each of our guest speakers in just a moment. But first, I also want to remind all of our attendees again, you can find out what we're working on our upcoming webinars if you follow us on SoundCloud. We have a podcast there. Also, we're across social media. The Knowledge Group can be found on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the latest news and event information, and again, by subscribing to our Knowledge Group podcast. It's on iTunes and SoundCloud. You'll hear the latest on what speakers intend to cover at our future events. Also, a reminder again, if you're looking for a new way to reach customers and allow them to book and manage appointments with ease, we can help you there too by building a custom, cost-effective in Android. Find out more when you visit appsforlawfirms.net. We have a few moments remaining. I want to turn back to each of our speakers again to say thank you so much for these excellent presentations. Any final closing remarks you'd like to give to our attendees before we close out? Mr. Guy Proper.
Thank you. I'd like to reiterate the points I closed my presentation with. The first point is that it's very important to understand that the most successful actors behind ransomware are professional people, and they are doing active research on their targets and on attack techniques, and also on the Windows operating system and other operating systems in order to be ahead of security companies. So it's important to understand that they are professional and the security community has to deal with them. And the second thing is to defend against ransomware. The best defense is to be aware of emails that are being sent to you, not to click on suspicious links or open suspicious emails at all. And in any case, you should have a good and layered endpoint protection program on your endpoints to prevent attacks and not just detect them. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much again to Guy Proper. And again, attendees, if there are additional questions, feel free to reach out to Guy. That events materials that you have has his contact information. Any final thoughts from you, Melissa, that you'd like to share before we close out?
Hi, I'm not sure if you heard, excuse me. First of all, tabletop exercises can be done with ransomware. I'm finding that they're occurring in healthcare organizations. If anyone is interested in slides and general information, they can contact me after the webinar. I think my final points are my final points, but preparation and prevention are key, as is awareness.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you again to Melissa Krasnow for being with us. Thank you to Guy Proper as well. A reminder again, you can follow us across our social media platforms to find out what we're working on and subscribe to our podcast, the Knowledge Group podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud. Again, we're also on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you are applying for continuing education credit, again, that survey coming to you should just take about 2 to 3 minutes for you to complete. And a reminder, again, we want to thank all of you for being with us. You can contact our speakers if a question comes up. Again, just do that on the events materials that you have. Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude today's webcast. Ransomware, Best Defense Strategies Against Attacks. We thank you all for being with us.